Keanu Reeves had always been known as a calm and gentle man, someone who avoided drama and lived a simple life despite his worldwide fame. Fans often saw him sitting quietly on park benches, traveling on the subway like any ordinary person, or giving to charity without making a big announcement. He lived in a world where cameras followed him, but he carried himself with humility. To many, he was not just an actor. He was a symbol of kindness. Yet behind that calm face, Keanu had also lived through many storms. He had lost loved ones, faced tragedies, and learned the hard way that life was unpredictable. One morning, while preparing for a usual day, Keanu felt something was not right in his body. It started with a discomfort, then turned into a wave of weakness that left him unable to stand properly. At first, he thought it was just exhaustion, the price of years of long movie shoots, stunts, and late nights, but this felt different. He tried to brush it off, but soon the pain became unbearable. His assistant noticed his pale face and insisted on taking him to the hospital immediately. Keanu, never one to make a fuss, quietly agreed when he arrived at the hospital. The staff was surprised to see him. They had seen celebrities before, but Keanu carried no entourage. No flashing lights and no demands. He simply walked in, dressed plainly, and waited like everyone else for a moment. People around him were confused. Was this really the same man who fought villains in action movies? The same man admired on red carpets? He looked fragile, tired, and human. He sat quietly in the waiting area, clutching his side, breathing deeply. Hoping the pain would ease, doctors quickly examined him, and he was admitted to a private room. The diagnosis was not publicly shared, but it was serious enough to require treatment and rest. For Keanu, lying in a hospital bed was a strange experience. He had spent his life giving strength to others, through his roles and through his kindness. Yet now he felt weak, unable to control his body. He listened to the beeping machines and watched the white ceiling, thinking of how fragile life truly was, even in pain. Keanu remained polite to everyone around him. When nurses came in, he smiled faintly and thanked them. When doctors checked his condition, he listened carefully and nodded. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything. He was simply grateful that people were there to help. This humility surprised some of the younger staff, who had imagined celebrities would be difficult. But there were also others who whispered and laughed, treating his illness as gossip rather than a moment of respect. For Keanu, however, the most important thing was to heal. He thought of the many challenges he had survived in the past, losing his best friend, losing the woman he loved, living through loneliness while the world celebrated him on screen. Compared to those moments, this illness was another test, a reminder that even the strongest can fall. He closed his eyes and told himself that every storm passes, and he would rise again as the days passed. Hospital staff noticed his unusual quietness. Unlike other patients who complained about food, about pain, about delays, Keanu stayed calm. He asked simple questions, he thanked people, and he never once acted like he deserved special treatment. He blended into the background like any other patient. Yet for those who paid attention, there was something deeply moving about seeing a man who had been a hero in movies, lying weak yet still dignified. News of his state did not leak out immediately. Keanu valued his privacy and the hospital respected it. But inside those walls, a silent story was unfolding. It was the story of a man whose strength was not in muscles or fame, but in his ability to endure suffering with grace. It was the story of someone who reminded the world that no matter how successful, everyone is human. Everyone gets sick and everyone deserves kindness. Each night when the hospital grew quiet, Keanu would look out of the window at the city lights. He thought about the people who loved him, the fans who admired him, and the strangers who never knew the battles he had fought. He thought of how fragile health could be, and how little control humans had over life. Sometimes he smiled to himself, remembering that even in his weakest moment, he was learning something new. That strength was not only about standing tall, it was also about lying down and facing pain without fear, though he did not know it yet. This quiet hospital stay would soon reveal something shocking. It would test the character of those around him. It would expose cruelty and compassion, and it would end with a gesture so powerful that it would silence those who had mocked him. For now, though, Keanu lay in that bed, breathing slowly, waiting for recovery, carrying within him the same gentle spirit that had always set him apart from the rest. When Keanu Reeves was moved into his hospital room, at first the staff treated him the way they treated any other patient. He was quiet, respectful, and never acted like a famous movie star. He said thank you every time someone adjusted his bed or brought him water. To some of the nurses, this was surprising. They expected arrogance or demands, but what they saw was humility. Yet not everyone reacted with kindness. In the corner of the hospital hallways, whispers began. A few younger staff members, who had only seen Keanu on television and in blockbuster movies, giggled and whispered whenever they walked past his door. To them, it felt unreal to see a man who once fought villains on screen now lying weak, pale and struggling to sit up straight. They thought it was funny, and they let their curiosity turn into gossip. "Look at him now," one nurse whispered to another. "He doesn't look like a hero at all." The words carried a sting. Though Keanu never showed he heard them, another staff member laughed quietly. "I can't believe that's the same man people admire so much. He looks so fragile." "I guess fame doesn't protect you from sickness." Their voices were soft. But in the silence of a hospital corridor, whispers travel far. Some of them even joked about his choice to come without bodyguards or assistants. He could have stayed in a fancy private clinic, but here he is. "Just like any other patient," one said with a smirk. They saw his simplicity not as dignity but as weakness. They could not understand that Keanu chose privacy and humility over luxury. But not all staff behaved this way. A few stood quietly, watching their colleagues. Feeling uncomfortable, they saw Keanu's soft smile when a nurse entered. The way he said thank you even when his voice was weak. They noticed how he never complained. Not about pain, not about food, not about delays. He accepted everything with calm patience. These quiet observers felt respect for him, though they didn't yet speak up. Inside his room, Keanu sensed the atmosphere. He was not a man unaware of his surroundings. He noticed the way some people looked at him, the way their laughter faded when he turned his head, but he chose silence. He knew from life's long lessons that reacting to cruelty only fed it. He preferred to let time reveal people's true character. In his weaker moments, when the pain sharpened and the loneliness of the hospital grew heavier, he sometimes wondered why people found joy in mocking others, especially someone sick and vulnerable. Yet he reminded himself that kindness often shines brighter when cruelty tries to darken the room. So instead of anger, he chose peace. He lay still, whispering quiet thanks to the nurse who brought him medicine, to the cleaner who replaced his sheets, to the doctor who explained his progress. Meanwhile, outside his room, gossip spread like wildfire. Some staff even exaggerated stories, saying Keanu looked worse than he really did, or that he was too weak to even speak. They laughed, forgetting that illness was a reality for everyone, rich or poor, famous or unknown. They did not realize their words revealed more about their own hearts than about the man they mocked. Among the patients, rumors also began. Some heard staff laughing and wondered why anyone would laugh at a man fighting illness. Others felt disappointed. They had admired the hospital workers as caregivers, but seeing them mock a sick man, especially someone who had given joy to millions through his art, broke their trust. Still, the whispers continued. Like a cruel background noise in the sterile hallways, Keanu remained calm, but the situation was not hidden from everyone. One nurse in particular began to feel ashamed. She had joined the laughter once, but later, when she entered his room and saw his tired smile, she felt her heart sink. Here was a man who had no reason to be humble, yet he showed more grace than anyone she had ever treated. She realized how wrong the whispers were. The contrast between the whispering staff and Keanu's gentle silence grew clearer each day. For every cruel laugh outside his door, there was a soft thank you inside it. For every mocking word, there was a calm nod of appreciation. Slowly, some staff began to feel guilty. They started to lower their voices when walking past his room, and a few stopped gossiping altogether. But for others, the mockery continued. They could not understand why a man with fame, fortune, and power had chosen to lie in a plain hospital room. They mistook humility for weakness. They mistook kindness for naivety. They believed the role of a hero ended when the cameras stopped rolling. Yet Keanu's true strength was not in action scenes or fight choreography. It was in moments like this when he could have complained, demanded, or even lashed out, but instead he stayed silent. Choosing dignity over confrontation, he endured not only his illness but also the cruelty of whispers, reminding everyone that greatness is revealed not when life is easy but when life is hardest. What those staff members did not know was that their laughter would one day be replaced with shock, that the same man they mocked would leave behind an act of generosity so extraordinary It would silence them forever. For now, though, the whispers continued, filling the hospital halls, unaware that they were shaping a story that would soon turn against them. The hospital room was quiet. The only sounds came from the soft beeping of the machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses walking past in the hallway. Keanu Reeves lay on his bed. Staring at the ceiling, his body felt weak, but his mind was awake. This was the kind of silence where thoughts grew louder. Keanu had lived much of his life in the spotlight. He had walked red carpets, given interviews, and been cheered by thousands of fans. Yet in this hospital bed there were no cameras, no flashing lights, no applause. He was just another human being, struggling with illness. The world outside continued with its noise and rush, but inside the room, time felt slower, almost frozen in this isolation. Keanu's thoughts drifted to his past. He remembered his childhood, growing up without much stability. Moving from place to place, he had faced loneliness early, and those memories returned now, lying in the stillness of the hospital. He remembered the tragedies that had marked his life, the loss of his best friend, the loss of his partner, the emptiness that followed. Each memory carried pain, but also a lesson. He realized how fragile life truly was. One moment a person could be standing strong, smiling, and the next, they could be lying in a bed, dependent on others. He thought about how illness did not choose based on wealth or fame. It came for everyone silently, without warning. This truth humbled him even more. Though the loneliness pressed against him, Keanu did not allow bitterness to grow. Instead, he used this time to reflect. He asked himself what truly mattered. Was it the fame, the awards, the money, or was it something else? He thought of the people he had helped quietly, of the charities he had supported without telling anyone. He thought of how small acts of kindness could outlive even the biggest Hollywood films. At times he felt the sting of the whispers outside his room. He had noticed the staff who mocked his condition. He heard faint laughter when they thought he could not hear. It hurt, but he reminded himself that people often mocked what they did not understand. They saw him as a star, not as a man. They did not know his scars or his battles. To them, his illness was entertainment. To him, it was another reminder of life's unpredictability. But in the silence, Keanu found strength. He had been through worse storms. He remembered nights when grief had swallowed him, days when loneliness felt endless. If he could survive that, he could survive this too. He told himself that healing was not only about medicine, it was about the will to keep going. He thought about his fans, people around the world who saw him as a hero. If they could see him now lying weak in a plain hospital bed, would they still admire him? He believed they would, not because he was unbreakable, but because he was real. A true hero was not someone who never fell, but someone who rose again after every fall. Keanu also reflected on the meaning of kindness. He thought about how even small words from the nurses who treated him with respect lifted his spirit. A simple smile, a polite gesture, these were powerful in moments of pain. He realized how much humanity needed compassion, especially in hospitals where people were most vulnerable. He promised himself that if he got better, he would continue to support causes that brought comfort and healing to others. The nights were the hardest. The city outside glittered with lights, but his room was dim. Sometimes he felt completely alone. Sometimes his thoughts became heavy. But then he reminded himself that loneliness was not new. He had faced it many times, and each time it had taught him to rely on his inner strength. He whispered to himself that this too would pass. During one long night as he lay awake, he thought of his late friend. He imagined what his friend would say if he saw him now. He pictured encouragement, a reminder to keep fighting. That thought gave him comfort. It was as if the people he had lost still lived within him, guiding him in his hardest moments. Though days felt long, Keanu found peace in reflection. He realized that the hospital bed, as cold and lonely as it was, had given him something rare. It had given him time to pause, to look back, and to look within. In the busy world of movies and fame, he rarely had such silence now. He saw it as both a challenge and a gift. The isolation shaped his thoughts. He understood more clearly that strength was not about fighting on screens. It was about enduring quietly without losing dignity. It was about facing whispers without anger, pain without fear, and loneliness without despair. What he did not know was that these reflections were preparing him for what was to come. The whispers outside his room would soon collide with his silence, and his response would surprise everyone. For now he remained in isolation, but within his heart, He was gathering the quiet power that would soon change the story completely. While some hospital staff whispered and mocked Keanu Reeves, not everyone joined them. There were a few who stood silently, watching carefully. These were the quiet observers, the ones who noticed what others missed. They saw the way he carried himself, even in weakness, with a kind of calm that did not match the cruel laughter outside his room. One young nurse often walked past his door. She noticed how he always looked up and smiled, even when his face was pale from pain. When she handed him medicine, he did not just take it silently. He whispered a soft thank you. His voice was weak but sincere. That single word carried more warmth than many loud conversations she had heard in her life. Another observer was an older doctor. He had treated many wealthy patients before. Most came with demands, expecting special treatment. Some snapped at the staff. Others acted as if they owned the place. But Keanu was different. He never raised his voice, never acted like he was above anyone. He listened, nodded, and showed gratitude for even the smallest things. This humility stayed in the doctor's mind. The quiet observers noticed a pattern. Whenever the mocking staff walked by, they spoke with sarcasm and laughter. But when they entered Keanu's room, the atmosphere changed. Inside, there was no arrogance, only respect from him. He never confronted them, never asked why they whispered. His silence seemed to shame them more than anger ever could. One night, the young nurse entered his room to check his IV. She hesitated, remembering how some of her colleagues had laughed earlier. As she adjusted the drip, Keanu looked at her and said, "Thank you for taking care of me." She froze for a moment. Feeling guilty, she had not mocked him, but she had stayed silent when others did. His kindness made her realize that silence could also be a form of weakness. From that moment, she decided she would not join the laughter. The observers began to share small, unspoken bonds with him. They exchanged respectful glances, offered him comfort through gentle words, and made sure his room was quiet and peaceful. They could not stop the whispers in the hallways, but they could make his space a safe place. In their hearts, they admired him deeply. The other patients also became part of this silent group. Some had overheard the gossip, but when they saw Keanu being rolled past them in a wheelchair, they noticed something different. Unlike many famous people, he did not look annoyed or distant. He looked human, approachable, humble. Even when in pain, he nodded at others. Acknowledging their presence, this small act touched many. Among the patients was a middle-aged man recovering from surgery. He had once been a fan of Keanu's movies. Seeing the actor in such a fragile state moved him. He whispered to his roommate, "People think being strong means never falling, but look at him. He's strong because he accepts his weakness with dignity." That patient, too, became an observer, quietly spreading respect instead of gossip. The quiet observers were not loud. They did not argue with the mocking voices, but their silence carried weight. It showed that not everyone agreed. Some respected Keanu. Even if they did not say it out loud, they knew words were cheap. But respect was shown in actions, and their actions were simple but powerful, treating him with humanity. At times, Keanu noticed their kindness. When a nurse adjusted his blanket carefully, when a doctor asked him if he was comfortable, when a patient gave him a nod of respect in the hallway, he noticed these little gestures. They reminded him that even in a place where some mocked, goodness still lived. That thought gave him strength. The observers also began to feel protective of him. Whenever they heard mocking whispers, they felt anger rising in their hearts. Some even started to speak less with those who laughed. Their loyalty slowly shifted toward Keanu, though he never asked for it. His quiet dignity drew them in without words. As the days passed, the contrast became sharper. On one side were the mockers, who saw only weakness. On the other side were the quiet observers, who saw courage, humility, and grace. The hospital became a stage where both sides revealed their character, and Keanu, without saying much, was at the center. One evening, the young nurse returned to his room. She brought food and placed it gently on the table. Keanu looked at her and said softly, "You've been kind, and kindness means more than anything." She felt her eyes burn with tears in that moment. She understood that her small actions were not small to him. They were his light in an otherwise lonely room. The observers continued to watch, learning silently from the man they were treating. They realized that strength was not about fame or power. It was about how one treated others in moments of weakness. Keanu was teaching them without lectures, without speeches, just by being himself. In the quiet corners of the hospital, Conversations began to change. The observers started telling others about his humility. Slowly, the whispers of mockery were met with whispers of respect. Not everyone joined, but a shift was happening, all because Keanu chose dignity over anger and silence over confrontation. The observers would later remember this time, not just as days in a hospital, but as days when they witnessed what true character looked like. They saw that kindness could exist even in pain, that humility could shine brighter than fame, and that sometimes the greatest lessons in life come not from words, but from the quiet way a person endures hardship. The days in the hospital passed slowly. Keanu Reeves spent most of his time resting, listening to the quiet sounds of machines and reflecting on his life. The whispers outside his room still continued. Though sometimes softer, some staff members still mocked him, while others had grown silent after seeing his dignity. But one moment was about to change everything, a moment that would become the turning point. Among the nurses, there was one young woman who had once laughed with her colleagues. At first, she joined the whispers because she thought it was harmless. To her, Keanu was just another celebrity, someone too far from her world to be truly real. She thought he would never notice, but the more she entered his room, the more she saw how different he was. He was not proud or arrogant, he was humble. He smiled even in pain, and thanked her for the smallest things. One night, she came into his room to check his chart. She found him sitting up slowly, his face pale but calm. He looked at her and said in his soft voice, "You must be tired from working all night. Thank you for being here." The word stunned her. She had never expected such kindness from a man who was fighting pain. For a moment, she stood silently, unable to reply. Her throat tightened with guilt. When she walked out of his room, she remembered all the times she had laughed with the others. She remembered the cruel comments, the mocking tones, and it made her heart heavy. She realized she had been unfair, judging someone who had done nothing but show respect. That night she could not sleep. The memory of his gratitude echoed in her mind. The next morning she made a decision. Instead of pretending nothing happened, she went back to his room. She stood near his bed and whispered, "I'm sorry." Keanu looked at her. His expression calm but curious. She continued, "I joined the others when they laughed. I should not have. You don't deserve that. You've been nothing but kind." Keanu looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were gentle. He did not scold her. He did not look angry. Instead, he gave a small smile and said, "It's all right. People sometimes forget that everyone struggles. What matters is that you see it now." His words lifted a weight from her heart. She felt tears forming in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. This exchange was the turning point. For the first time, someone from the group of mockers admitted the truth and asked for forgiveness. It was not a loud moment, not one filled with drama, but it carried power. It showed that Keanu's silence and kindness had not been wasted. It had touched someone deeply enough to change them. The young nurse began to act differently. She started treating him with more care, making sure his room was comfortable. She spoke kindly to him, not out of guilt anymore, but out of genuine respect. Her change did not go unnoticed. Other staff members saw her actions. Some mocked her for switching sides, but others grew thoughtful. They wondered why she had changed. And the answer was simple. Keanu's character had reached her heart. Keanu himself continued as he always did, calm, polite, and quiet, but inside, he felt a sense of relief. He had known the whispers were cruel, yet he had chosen not to fight them. Now, seeing this young nurse find her conscience, he felt that his patience had not been in vain. It reminded him that even small acts of kindness could plant seeds of change in others. The turning point spread silently. The nurse told her closest colleagues about her apology. Some dismissed it, but a few listened and began to question themselves. They thought about the man lying in that hospital bed. They thought about how he never complained, never demanded, never treated anyone with disrespect. The more they thought, the more they realized their laughter had been cruel. Meanwhile, Keanu remained the same. He continued thanking the staff, smiling faintly, and showing respect to everyone. But now there was a different atmosphere in the room. The young nurse often checked in on him, speaking gently, making sure he was comfortable. To Keanu, these were small gestures, but they meant the world. They reminded him that compassion was still alive, even in the middle of cruelty. The turning point was not just about the nurse. It was about the lesson it carried. It showed that kindness, even when met with mockery, could still win. It proved that silence and dignity could change hearts more than anger ever could. In a world where people often believe strength is loud, Keanu showed that true strength could also be quiet. Gentle and patient, the nurse never forgot that day. She carried his words with her long after her shift ended. She told herself that she would never again mock or judge a patient no matter who they were. Keanu had taught her something her training never had, that the soul of a person was more important than their appearance or their fame. For Keanu, this moment gave him comfort in his illness. He saw that even when people treated him unfairly, his response could still inspire goodness. It reminded him that pain could be transformed into something meaningful. This was the true turning point, not just for the nurse, but for everyone who later heard about it. What began as whispers of cruelty was slowly turning into whispers of respect. The hospital, once filled with laughter at his expense, was beginning to change its tone, and it all started because Keanu chose kindness when he could have chosen anger. Keanu Reeves stayed in the hospital for several more days. His body slowly began to heal, and the doctors finally said he was ready to leave. The whispers in the hallway had grown quieter by then. Some staff members still carried guilt. Some had already changed their behavior, and others pretended nothing had happened. But no one knew what was coming. They thought his stay would end quietly, just as it had begun, but Keanu had something else in mind. A gesture no one could have imagined on the morning of his discharge. Keanu sat on the edge of his bed looking out the window. The city was alive with movement. People rushing to work, cars filling the streets. He thought about his time inside the hospital walls, about the whispers, the kindness of the quiet observers. The turning point with the young nurse, he realized this experience had taught him another lesson about people, about cruelty and about compassion. He decided he would leave behind more than silence. He would leave behind something that would make a difference. Before leaving, he asked to meet the hospital's administrator. The request surprised the staff. Celebrities rarely wanted to speak directly with administrators. They usually left quickly, avoiding attention. But Keanu walked slowly, with calm steps, and greeted the administrator politely. The staff who saw him thought he would complain about the gossip or the treatment. Instead, he spoke with gentle words. He thanked the hospital for taking care of him. He praised the doctors and the nurses who had shown him kindness. He did not mention the mocking at all. His dignity remained untouched. Then came the moment that no one expected. Keanu pulled out a check from his bag. He signed it quietly, handed it to the administrator, and said, "Please use this to improve patient care and support your staff." The administrator glanced at the check, and his eyes widened in shock. It was not a small amount. It was a sum so large that it could change the hospital's future. The administrator stammered, unable to believe what he was holding. When the news of the donation spread through the staff, there was silence. Those who had mocked him felt their faces burn with shame. They had laughed at his illness, whispered cruel things behind his back, and now the very man they had mocked had given them a gift beyond imagination. Some could not even meet each other's eyes. Others sat in silence, realizing how deeply they had misjudged him. The young nurse who had once apologized felt tears fill her eyes when she heard. She had seen his kindness, but she had not expected this level of generosity. She whispered to herself, "He didn't just forgive us, he blessed us." To her, it felt like a lesson from life itself, a reminder that true strength was not in revenge, but in kindness so big that it left people speechless. Even the patients began to hear about the gesture. They looked at each other with amazement. Many of them had already respected him for his quiet dignity. But this act placed him even higher in their hearts. They knew he could have left without a word. He could have forgotten the hospital once he walked out, but instead, he chose to leave behind something that would help people long after his stay. Some of the mocking staff tried to laugh it off, saying he just wanted good publicity. But deep inside, they knew it wasn't true. No cameras were there, no reporters, no press release. He had made the donation quietly, without any demand for recognition. It was not for the world to see. It was for the people in that building. That truth cut through their excuses and left them uncomfortable. The administrators decided to use the money to upgrade equipment, improve patient rooms, and support staff training. It was a gift that would touch countless lives. Every patient who would later lie in those beds, every nurse who would learn new skills, every doctor who would use better tools, all would unknowingly benefit from the generosity of a man who had once been mocked in those same halls. For Keanu, it was simple. He did not see it as a grand act. To him, it was just another way to give back. He had lived through loss and loneliness, and he knew the value of kindness. Money could not bring back the people he had lost, but it could bring comfort to those who were suffering. That was enough for him. He did not need applause or recognition. He only wanted to leave behind something good. As he walked out of the hospital, dressed simply as always, some of the staff watched him with quiet respect. A few lowered their heads, ashamed of how they had treated him. Others whispered softly, this time not in mockery but in admiration. The atmosphere had changed completely. It was as if his gesture had washed away the bitterness and replaced it with humility. The quiet observers felt proud. They had always known there was something different about him. Now the world inside the hospital knew too. The young nurse in particular felt that her life had changed. She promised herself she would never judge another patient again, because Keanu had shown her that every person, no matter how strong or weak, deserved respect. The gesture no one expected became the moment that defined his stay. It was not the illness, not the whispers, not even the pain. It was the act of giving when no one thought he would. It was the choice to respond to cruelty with generosity. To this day, those who were there remember that moment. Some remember it with shame, some with gratitude, but all remember it as a lesson they would never forget. After Keanu Reeves left the hospital, everything felt different. His quiet presence had gone, but something had been left behind. Not just the check, but a deep sense of reflection in the hearts of everyone who had been near him. The staff walked the same hallways, wore the same uniforms, and worked their usual shifts, but their minds were no longer the same. The large donation had changed the hospital in a physical way. New equipment arrived within weeks. Old machines were replaced, patient rooms were cleaned and painted, and a small section was turned into a peaceful lounge for families waiting during emergencies. It was a fresh start, a visible improvement, but something much bigger had happened inside the people who worked there. The young nurse who had apologized to Keanu found herself treating patients with more care than ever. She smiled more, listened more, and showed extra kindness even when she was tired. Every time she passed the room where Keanu had stayed, she felt a quiet reminder to stay humble. She no longer joined in gossip or mocking laughter. Instead, she became a voice of calm in the busy, stressful world of the hospital. Other staff members began to notice her change. At first, they thought it was temporary, but over time, they saw her attitude was real. It made them think about how they treated patients too. A few nurses even gathered together during a break and talked about Keanu. They admitted they had judged him, laughed behind his back, and felt guilty afterward. That conversation was the first of many honest talks that followed. The ripple effect spread slowly, like circles in water after a stone is dropped. Staff who had once whispered cruel words began checking themselves before they spoke. Some started helping each other more. Some apologized to other patients for being impatient or cold. These were small actions, but they added up. The hospital, which had once been filled with silent judgment, now began to grow softer, kinder, more human. The hospital administrator also changed. After meeting Keanu and receiving the donation, he realized he had never taken the time to really know the patients. Now, he walked through the wards more often, talked to people, listened to their concerns. He started new programs for staff wellness and brought in workshops about compassion and respect. He wanted everyone to learn from the mistake they had made and the lesson they had been given. Even the patients felt the change. They noticed how nurses were gentler, how doctors explained things more patiently, and how the environment seemed less cold. One elderly man who had been staying in the hospital for weeks said, "Something feels better here, like the air is different." He didn't know why, but he could feel it. News of Keanu's act didn't reach the public immediately. He hadn't told the media, and the hospital respected his privacy. But over time, word began to spread. A few nurses told friends, who told others, and slowly, the story made its way outside the hospital walls, not through headlines or big news stories, but through whispered stories that carried power. People began to talk about what had happened, not just about the donation, but about the way Keanu had behaved while he was sick, about his silence, his kindness, his forgiveness, and how he had never once used his fame to demand special treatment. These stories reached other hospitals, other nurses, and even strangers who had never met him. And each time someone heard the story, it planted a seed in their heart. Back inside the hospital, the mocking voices were nearly gone. Those who had laughed before now walked quietly. Some of them avoided the topic altogether. Others tried to pretend they had never said anything cruel. But deep down they remembered, and they knew they had been wrong. It wasn't easy to admit, but the truth had already done its work. The young nurse who had first apologized decided to write a personal letter to Keanu. She didn't expect him to reply, but she wanted him to know how much he had changed her. In the letter she wrote, "You didn't just leave a check behind, you left a lesson. You showed us what true strength looks like, and I will never forget it." She mailed it to his agency, not knowing if he would ever see it, but hoping her words would reach him somehow. Months later, people still talked about him. New staff members heard the story during their training. Some didn't believe it at first, but the ones who were there confirmed it. The story became part of the hospital's identity, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The ripple effect didn't stop in one place. It continued moving, touching lives one by one. Keanu had not shouted, demanded, or punished anyone. He had simply been himself, and that had been enough to change a place where judgment once ruled. It taught everyone who worked there that you never know who someone really is, and you never know how deeply your actions might hurt or heal. It showed them that kindness could ripple outward just as powerfully as cruelty, and that one person's quiet example could make hundreds rethink the way they live and work. And in the center of it all was a man who never asked for recognition, a man who had once been mocked for being sick, but who left behind a legacy much greater than money. He left behind a wave of change. Keanu Reeves had left the hospital weeks ago, but his presence still lingered in every hallway, every patient room, and every quiet conversation among the staff. People no longer spoke about him as just a famous actor. They spoke about the way he had carried himself, the way he had stayed humble during his illness, and most of all, the way he had responded to cruelty with kindness. His story had become something greater than a memory. It had become a lesson, a reminder of how one person's actions could change many lives. The staff who had once whispered behind his back now looked at each patient with new eyes. They remembered how they had judged a man before knowing his story, and they promised themselves they would never do that again. The nurse who had first apologized to Keanu became a quiet leader among her coworkers, not because she gave speeches or demanded change, but because she lived differently now. She treated every patient with respect, no matter how rich or poor, famous or unknown. And when new nurses joined the hospital, she told them the story of the man in room 305, the man who had been mocked but never once showed anger, the man who had left behind more than money. One day a young intern asked her, "Why do you always talk about him like he was some kind of hero?" The nurse smiled and replied, "Because he was, but not in the way you think. He didn't save lives like a doctor. He didn't rescue someone from fire or danger. He saved us from our own blindness, from our own coldness. He reminded us that kindness matters, even when no one is watching." Even the hospital administrator often thought about that day when Keanu handed him the check. He remembered the way Keanu spoke, calm and steady, without pride, just a simple request to use the money to help people. The administrator had met many rich and powerful people, but none had touched his heart like this man. Keanu didn't want his name on a plaque or his photo on a wall. He wanted better care for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Outside the hospital, the story continued to spread quietly. A medical student who had heard the tale from a friend decided to write about it in a blog post. The post went viral within days. People across the world read it and shared it. Some cried, some felt inspired, some were simply shocked that someone so famous could be so gentle. The world saw Keanu Reeves in a new light, not just as a movie star, but as a silent teacher of kindness. Keanu himself never spoke about it. He went back to his normal life, attending film sets, riding the subway, walking the streets without bodyguards, just like before. He stayed away from loud fame and media attention. When asked about his hospital stay during a rare interview, he only smiled and said, "It was a time of learning," and left it at that. But deep inside, he carried the memories with him. The pain, the whispers, the apology, the change. He remembered the young nurse who looked him in the eyes and said, "Sorry." He remembered the staff who stood by him quietly, offering silent respect. He remembered how one act of forgiveness had started a wave of change, and that was enough for him. He had learned long ago that life was not about perfection. It was about moments, about how people treated each other in those moments, and how simple choices could echo far beyond what the eye could see. In the hospital, he had been weak in body but strong in spirit, and that strength had touched lives in ways he never planned. The lesson left behind was not written in books, it was written in actions. It was in the way a nurse chose kindness over laughter, the way a doctor listened more closely, the way a janitor made sure a patient's room was warm and clean without being asked. It was in the way people began to think before they spoke, and care before they judged. Years later, the hospital changed its slogan to something simple, something inspired by the story that had transformed them. It read, "Every patient matters, every moment counts," and it was placed near the entrance where everyone could see it. Some people passed it without thinking, but others stopped and smiled, not knowing where those words came from, but feeling their truth anyway. Keanu never returned to that hospital, but his story stayed not as a tale of sickness, but as a symbol of grace. He had been laughed at when he was at his weakest, but he responded not with anger but with a gift, a lesson, and a quiet strength that would never be forgotten. And so, the man who had been mocked in a hospital room became a silent hero, not through battles or loud speeches, but through patience, humility, and a gesture no one expected. The people who once laughed now remembered him with respect, and those who had stood by him carried his story like a light in their hearts. His legacy was not in awards or headlines. It was in every changed heart, every kind word, and every silent moment where someone chose to do better, all because of a man who had once been broken, but chose to heal others even while healing himself.